Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 2 of series 11. The question for today is, does ethics face insurmountable problems that call for its reinterpretation? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, chapter 4, section 1. My underlying question is again, what can we do with our lives or human existence as consciousness? And I answer that this question must be answered in terms of value, meaning and purpose, as well as ethics. That is, along with others like religion and aesthetics, ethics is one of our primary expressions of value. This is because ethical principles are values that guide right action, and they thereby should tell us how to live or even what we can do with our lives. But ethical theory and moral action are beset by serious problems that have not yet been resolved. My usual question is whether ethics is an adequate approach to understanding the human condition. But today I want to focus on problems of ethics both as theory and as a guide to moral action. That is ethics still viable, or has it been overwhelmed by its own internal problems? I have previously given critiques of the three main theories of ethics. These are Kantian ethics, virtue theory, and utilitarianism. So I will review but won't re-argue these criticisms again today. Yet my criticisms of ethics here will be even more far-reaching. That is, the criticisms are not only of the fundamental concepts of ethics like objective and intrinsic value, free will, justice, rights, justification, other people, truth and reason, but they are also about the meaning and coherence of the concepts of ethics and morality. That is, the concept and the meaning of ethics has come to us through religious, philosophical and social contexts. But these contexts have been transformed by concepts of consciousness, the unconscious, genetics, neurology, epistemology, language, and the social and psychological construction of human thought. A few examples of how our conception of ethics has changed are: 1. The mistaken medieval idea that mental illness is morally blameworthy. 2. That modern moral judgment is mitigated by social and psychological circumstances. And 3. Modern moral thought is more interested in attitudes and value states than raw action. In addition to these general changes, they have been underlined by various philosophical schools of thought, such as that of Nietzsche, existentialism, and postmodernism. And even the mainstream philosopher Bernard Williams describes ethics as a peculiar institution. Yet before going any further, we should first look at the problem of defining ethics and morality. Ethics and morality are often regarded as synonymous, but are also sometimes differentiated. For Ronald Dworkin, for example, ethics is about living a good life, and morality is about how we treat others. For Anthony Grayling, ethics is about character, whereas morality implies moralizing about right action. As for myself, I take ethics as such to be about theory and principles, and morality to be about moral action and intent. I also use the term ethics to accommodate a folkloric or ordinary view of ethics as supposedly objective. I can thereby usefully describe slavery, for example, as unethical from a wider point of view, but that slavery need not be immoral because slavers might not know any better. More specifically, I hold that morality involves judgments about matters that are deemed to be moral. They are only deemed to be moral because I believe that the content isn't fixed or definitive. So morality can be described by its moral valuations being reflected back onto the agent. But this presupposes that those moral valuations are designated as moral by the agent. And such a process is moving away from the core meaning of ethics and morality. That is, as a means of determining right and wrong moral action and thought. This problem is illustrated by mistakenly defining ethics as always having to be about relations with other people. This is because morals can obviously also be about private states like self-deception and authenticity. And the following discussions reveal a wider scope of ethics than just relations with other people. Yet relations with other people is not only one of the problems that ethics has to deal with, it is also one that any philosophy of life has to deal with, as discussed shortly. But to define ethics and morality further, we also need to outline the problem of anthropocentricity. That is, there is a tendency to regard ideas like truth, justice, ethics, and morality as absolute concepts. But the history and variability of these concepts show that they are anthropocentrically constructed. One of the consequences of this is that the limits or boundaries of the concept of ethics cannot be definitively set. One example of this is found in the ambiguous distinction between ethics and aesthetics. For example, is the destruction of a forest or dolphins ethically or aesthetically wrong? The uncertainty of the answer indicates that these concepts have indistinct boundaries. Another example is Nietzsche's account of going beyond moral good and evil with an aesthetic justification. He writes, "It is only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified." And as a further indication of the unfinished nature of these concepts, he adds, "The future task of philosophers is to determine the order and rank among values." This anthropocentricity and ambiguity between morality, ethics, and aesthetics means that ethics cannot have the distinctiveness needed to make the kind of moral judgments that it claims. That is, this indistinctiveness and pliability allows ethics to be eclipsed by other categories. The problem is described another way in Tai Nguyen's notion of value collapse, if values are very explicit. He says that this clarity makes them very attractive but also simplistic, leaving out a lot of elaboration. This is the case with ethics that can reduce and impoverish the otherwise rich tapestry of life. Yet the respect and value of other people is nevertheless a distinct issue that theories of ethics have to deal with. Certain intuitions, like the intrinsic value of other people and not torturing babies, are often taken as moral truths. But these are unacceptable as ethical premises because we need to know why torturing babies is wrong. Is it because of their suffering, their intrinsic value, immoral intent, or some other reason? And just to accept that other people have intrinsic value isn't a sufficient basis of ethical theory or action. The motivations of a sadist, for example, might be enhanced by the intrinsic value of his victim. But even assuming a good will, should we value others more, less, or the same as ourselves? to resolve these issues, we need a much clearer understanding of relations with others. Kant's categorical imperative stipulates that other people are ends in themselves and must not be used only as means. Yet his respect for others as ends in themselves appears to derive from two sources. One, that human beings are rational creatures, and two, a universalization of the dignity we find in ourselves. But rationality isn't an adequate reason to attribute intrinsic value to others, as the value of non-rational but sentient creatures shows. And universalization isn't an adequate reason to value the intrinsic value of others. So there are two unresolved ethical issues here. One is establishing intrinsic value that I show elsewhere to be a widespread problem for ethics, even though I suggest a solution in the reflective but contingent capacity for self-value. The other issue is the widespread assumption that we must value the value of others. My answer here is a provisional value theory ethics to be outlined later. Yet Robert Nozick describes people as value-seeking eyes, and that we should give such the value that they have. But apart from his description of people as value-seeking eyes, this doesn't take us further than Kant. This is because he tells us that we should value things for the value that they have. But this presupposes objective value and also doesn't explain why we should value them. Utilitarianism makes an even greater assumption in the maximization of happiness for the maximum number of people. That is, the assumption that the individual will be motivated to act for the common good or the happiness of all. But utilitarianism is even more wanting in omitting intention in its ethical formula. And apart from the standard problem of knowing what the full consequences of any event are, and the practical problem of assessing, measuring and quantifying happiness, the idea of happiness as an adequate ethical principle or ethical objective is hardly credible. As practical social policy, however, Mill's principle of utility to maximize happiness is difficult to dispute. But as a principle of either ethics or life, it is an impoverishment of both moral and human experience. I give a much more detailed account of utilitarianism in my publications and other podcasts. And despite its popularity, virtue theory is the third main theory of ethics that is also theoretically lacking. That is, the virtues are intuitively attractive as moderations drawn from natural inclinations and social conventions. Yet Aristotle's virtue theory esteems excellence of character and disposition that intuits right action. One problem is that if only the virtuous can act virtuously, how do we become virtuous in order to act virtuously? Aristotle's answer was, practice the virtues in order to internalize them to become second nature. This answer may be adequate for an applied, practical or ad hoc ethics, but it leaves virtue theory ethics without detailed practical guidance and theory of action. And we find that Aristotle's virtue theory also lacks an appreciation of the concept of value. That is, it omits Kantian moral features of goodwill, intention and the value of people as ends in themselves. But Karl Marx may have overstated the point in saying that Aristotle had no concept of value. Yet in her modern moral philosophy, Elizabeth Anscombe shares a similar view. She writes that the term moral itself just doesn't seem to fit in its modern sense into an account of Aristotelian ethics, unquote, because, among other reasons, Anscombe tells us it lacks the concept of a moral sense of ought. But Anscombe was both sympathetic to virtue theory and critical of modern moral philosophy. She argues that the ideas of duty, obligation, and law given by God have been weakened or rejected, and that concepts of moral obligation and moral duty, the moral sense of ought to be jettisoned, unquote. And a suggestion of disposing the moral ought would have radical consequences for ethics, as would adopting the conceptual framework of virtue theory, as I intend to outline later. Yet it isn't just that these three theories of ethics have disqualifying limitations, but all of them. That is, it includes existentialist, postmodernism, and other theories of ethics of particular thinkers. And it's a surprising fact of the modern world that we do not yet have a viable theory of ethics. There is, however, considerable consensus over applied or practical ethics, but there is no agreed explanation of this consensus, unless, that is, we want to accept an as yet untested value theory ethics. And this isn't an isolated view, but one shared by others like Nietzsche, Thomas Nagel, and Alistair MacIntyre. MacIntyre claims, for example, that the language and practice of morality is in grave disorder and disarray, and he goes so far as to find these theories so different that their premises are incommensurate. That is, theories such as of Aristotle and Kant can't even be validly argued against each other. Yet a general problem that besets all these theories is the problem of objectivity. That is, both as a justification of ethical principles and as an increasing awareness of subjectivity. And this awareness of subjectivity led Mackie to his argument that there are no objective values. It has also led to his corollary that there are no intrinsic values in the material world. Likewise, we find that justice is a human invention, but a human idea that we can't do without, and that human rights are an objectification of human wants. There is a problem, however, of defining objectivity in such ways as ontological substantiality, as Mackie implies, or universality, social consensus, normativity, or even some other means of establishing order. Yet enlarging the problem of definition, we earlier broached the problem of the very coherence of the concept of ethics. Other more basic problems are Hume's is-ought constraint and More's naturalistic fallacy. Then there are deeper, often overlooked problems, such as how principles of ethics engage the moral will. It is often assumed, for example, that happiness must always be pursued, or that we must always value the value of others, or in Kantian terms, we must be rational and choose universality over other options. This is an aspect of the cognitive non-cognitive debate over the effect of certain conceptions of things. A standard illustration is found in the question, do we eat an apple because we desire it, or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively compelling, but moral motivation is more complex and difficult to ascertain. Considerations such as above often give rise to various forms of ethical relativity. Ethical relativity also arises from observing the different social practices evident in cultural relativity. The issue of both cultural and ethical relativity was recognized by Aristotle. For example, he wrote that fire burns in both Hellas, that is Greece, and Persia, but men's ideas of right and wrong vary from place to place. Aristotle demurred on ethical relativity because he fixed normative cultural and natural virtues on a golden mean. Yet his assessment of virtue and moral action weren't entirely fixed, but depended on circumstances. For example, he wrote that to be angry in the right way, to the right degree, for the right reason, is virtuous. So these comments indicate that there are at least three kinds of ethical relativity. One, an ethical relativity in which anything is justifiable, leading to nihilism that is difficult to maintain. Two, a relativity of the material content of action but related to an underlying moral code. But thinkers like Gilbert Harman note that such codes aren't any more privileged than any others. And three, an ethical relativity in the material content of action that is nevertheless relative to some central principle. This is my view, yet I'm appealing to a principle of value that includes but goes beyond ethics and morals. And this strategy is again moving beyond the now uncertain domain of ethics. There seem to be 3 or 4 responses to this supposed threat of ethical relativity. One response is to insist on absolute moral facts concerning certain acts or behaviour. Another is to make actions relative to absolute moral facts. A third is to attempt to establish a central normative principle. And a fourth response arises from variations on how to determine such a principle. So we should first briefly consider the seemingly untenable view of ethical absolutism. That is, that certain actions are always morally right or wrong in all circumstances or situations. Classic examples are slavery and torturing babies for fun, as Ronald Dworkin puts it. But torturing babies for fun already includes motivation, which takes it beyond the assessment of action alone. And we have also noted that harming other people is the easiest case for moral absolutes that we can make. Other examples like lying, stealing, sexual behaviour and religious injunctions are more difficult. There are also problems with thinking that my culture or my religion's moral injunctions are right and everyone else's are wrong. This kind of ethical absolutism is only possible in the absence of reflection. Mackie's argument that there are no objective values also looms large against such an absence of reflection, and the idea that certain actions can be morally right or wrong in themselves is also undermined by Mackie's rider that there are no intrinsic values in the fabric of the world. I agree with Mackie, but because values must always be sustained by a conscious mind. But it's important to note that Mackie argues that there are no objective values in the fabric of the world. So objective here pertains to the status of ontologically substantive objects, not universality. So Mackie's argument doesn't preclude normative or even universal values, yet it remains to be worked out what such normative values could be. So we must also consider a different kind of moral fact, not as action, but as an absolute moral principle. But it's unlikely that a general principle could be specific enough to be able to apply to every action. One example of this is Sam Harris's principle of well-being that can't give detailed guidance. Anthony Kenny similarly warned against universal principles of action, that a premise which is complete enough to defeat defeasibility, while specific enough to entail a practical conclusion, is surely chimerical. Unquote. But some philosophers, like Dworkin and Parfit, want to determine the right action for every situation. Bernard Williams has also accused Kantian and utilitarian ethics of this kind of overweening ambition. And John McDowell has similarly argued for the uncodifiability of Aristotle's virtue ethics. Extreme variability of circumstances preclude principles that could determine right action in every situation. The problem is about posing definitive principles for unknown and infinite possibilities of behaviour. Not only are new situations always being opened up by medical science and understanding of mind, but also by the further discovery and reformulation of the nature of ethics. In this light, Dworkin's claim of one objectively true account that yields one right answer seems preposterous. Yet both Dworkin and Parfit conveniently hold objectivist accounts of value and normative truth. And they both maintain the idea of the intrinsic value of physical objects and principles. It is similarly preposterous to suppose that there is a Platonic realm where objective values could reside. The potential infinite diversity of physical circumstances needs an infinite diversity of objective values. G.E. Moore called Leibniz's monads of a multiplicity of objects an ontological slum. We could similarly describe a Platonic realm of infinite objective values or actions. All these claims about objectivity are, of course, different ways to try to resolve the difficult problem of justification. The problem of justification again faces constraints posed by Hume's law and More's naturalistic fallacy. Hume's law is that a prescriptive moral ought cannot be deduced from a factual is or morals from reason. And Hume's law or principle, also known as the is-ought problem, has never been unseated. This is despite continuous challenges by such as Iris Murdoch, A.N. Pryor and John Searle. Hume's law has also been thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. More's naturalistic fallacy opposes the identification of moral values with natural properties. More claims that the moral good should not be confused with states like pleasant or desirable. At the time of writing, More claimed that such oversight could be found in practically every ethical theory. So unsurprisingly, even today, much of science ignores the problem, and some of those who ignore it are Sam Harris, Edward O. Wilson, Michael Shermer, Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking. My response to the problem of justification is to begin with value itself, not with moral facts or principles. This avoids both deriving ought from is and confusing affect states with value states. This strategy thereby circumvents both Hume's law and More's naturalistic fallacy. And it also brings us close to replacing ethical theory with value theory, and value as the overall sphere of ethics, morals, meaning, purpose, religion, romance and aesthetics. Another issue in ethics that invites a replacement by value is the question of motivation, or why should we act. A standard example of the problem is found in the common cognitive non-cognitive debate involving Kant and Hume. and this problem involves the question of how they express their principles in particular actions. For cognitivists, the answer is simple. Certain ideas mandate certain actions. But as in the example of the apple, motivation doesn't seem to be that simple. Cognitivists, like Kant, explain morals and motivation primarily in terms of reason and certain conceptions of things. Hume represents non-cognitivism, which seeks explanation in terms of affect and feeling. And Hume famously said that reason is the slave of the passions as the root of motivation. But cognitivists make the criticism that feeling by itself is blind. Modern analytic philosophy poses debate in terms of the two cognitive and non-cognitive mental states. But this classification is biased towards cognitivism and defines non-cognitive states negatively. So I supplement this classification using the four states of cognition, affect, will and value. But my point here is to refine the debate by including value in the equation. So we can break this dilemma by avoiding both cognitivist and desire-based or non-cognitivist reasons for action. That is, with Barry Maguire's promising but surprisingly overlooked value-based theory of reasons, unquote. This is a value-based theory of action advocated by Derek Parfit as well as myself. On a standard desire-based theory of action, we are motivated by the satisfaction of a desire. That is, if an action promotes the satisfaction of a desire, we have reason to perform that action. But on a value-based theory, reasons for action are delivered by the satisfactions of the values pursued. And a value-based theory of action also resolves both the problems of motivation and guidance for action. This is because value contains a volitional component that is required for motivational impetus. Yet values are always about something, and they always invoke further value judgments, which provides direction and material guidance. I give a fuller explanation in my account of a provisional value theory ethic. Now, G.E. Moore argued that the moral good is indefinable and cannot be reduced to natural states like pleasant, and that if it could, then morality would be based on it, and the concept of good would become meaningless. Taking this lead, we can return to my definition of ethics and morals as reflecting the value of its moral judgments back onto the agent, and this accounts for the agent's elevated sense of moral worth and self-esteem. The point here is that the moral good has been replaced by a mode of value, yet configured by the agent's own moral judgments. The credibility of this account derives from the explanative power of the concept of value detailed here and elsewhere. That is, it is one of the four constituents of consciousness as cognition, affect, will and value. And it has the ability to explain ethics, morals, meaning, purpose, aesthetics, romance and religion. So apart from its function of directing behaviour, which could also be done by pragmatic means, the hidden function of ethics is to elevate the value experience of the agent in such ways as self-esteem. Yet value theory seems not only better able to explain this process of self-valuation, but it also appears less troubled by problems of ethics that we have started to list. The replacement ethics with value theory also finds an advocate in Nietzsche and his aesthetic justification. On this view, value judgments will still be made, but made in the innocent terms of liking and disliking, and those aesthetic judgments will be shorn of the moral features of condemnation and retribution. Nietzsche is thereby a major figure in presenting this kind of threat to ethics, reflected in his book titles such as Beyond Good and Evil, The Revaluation of All Values, and on the Genealogy of Morals. And his critique of ethics is also seen as historical, sociological and psychological, as well as philosophical. That is, he looks at history to show the all too human origins of moral values. He looks to psychology to show the negative impulses that underlie apparently moral motives. And he looks to religion to reveal the supporting sociological ideology of ethics. Nietzsche, for example, examines the Gospels to show the negative motives underlying the Christian virtues. He finds there that love is grounded in hatred and forgiveness is conditioned by payment. He is critical of retributive aspects of Christian ethics that he calls the ethics of the hangman. Nietzsche rejects traditional morality and calls for the revaluation of all values, but he gives no definitive replacement. He claims instead that the future task of philosophers is to determine the order and rank among values. Yet he does advocate replacing moral values with aesthetic values and even sensual values. We haven't had time to explicate the historical, sociological and psychological details of Nietzsche's argument. Yet some of these themes are perhaps unexpectedly taken up by Sigmund Freud. Freud writes critically of what he calls natural ethics, saying that it has nothing to offer here except the narcissistic satisfaction of being able to think oneself better than others. But in light of what has been said here about the relation between ethics and value, we can modify Freud's view. That is, ethics need not be a way of thinking oneself better than others, but of thinking better of oneself. This implies the noted view of ethics or morals as a means of reflecting value onto oneself. Yet we can ask here for better ways of valuing oneself than either ethics or religion. And one of the negative aspects of both religion and ethics, decried by both Nietzsche and Freud, was that of guilt. And Freud also held that guilt was the most important problem in the development of civilization. Nietzsche's theme of sensuality is also taken up in Freud's interest or obsession with sexuality and the libido. And for Freud, the libido is an overarching force that replaces Nietzsche's will to power, and as either negative forces or alternative explanations, these are problems for ethics. Yet extending this critique, Hans-Georg Müller of Macau University has posed three pathologies of moral philosophy. Its psychological pathology is an insistence on principle and an obsessive moral zeal or fetishization. Its social pathology is the presupposition of fundamental dogmatic language that implies truth. And he holds its philosophical pathology is to assume certain actions imply objective moral laws. And these pathologies are posed as characterizing the Kantian thought that Nietzsche was so critical of. All these considerations of anthropocentricity, history, sociology and psychology of ethics lead us to ask about the social construction of our concept of ethics, not just in its development, but whether it is just a human invention or whether morals can find an alternative normative foundation, that is, in the structures of consciousness and value. I believe that it can, and I plan to do so in this series of ethics. But I want to finally show the effectiveness of a social construction of ethics that is often overlooked. But it can be illustrated using the three-phase process of consensus, objectification and internalization of Thomas Luckman and Peter Berger that I have referred to before. In the first phase of this explanation, there is agreement on what constitutes good behaviour. That is, most of us and most other people don't want to be subjected to crime or to be harmed. Secondly, there is social objectification of this agreement, of essentially what other people want. And thirdly, these objectifications of what other people want are internalized by individuals. This explains the feeling that ethics is objective and not just a human construction. But I think that it is a human construction, even though we can construct a normative but provisional value theory ethics. In conclusion, we can say that there are many problems of ethics that we haven't been able to cover here, but we hope at least to have outlined the main ones, including the obscure nature of ethics and morality. Yet this issue also reveals ethics as an indistinct category which undermines its moral authority. Yet a basic or elementary problem for traditional ethics was seen to be determining how we should act. The most distinct and most difficult issue in respect to determining action was relations with other people. But even if we recognize the intrinsic value of others, we also need a reason to respect their value. Such a reason is intuitively compelling, but theoretically elusive. The problem becomes more difficult in determining particular actions which encourages ethical relativity. To avoid ethical relativity, some universal guiding principle upheld by ethical theory is often posed. But we found that there is no theory of ethics that is agreed to be complete or acceptable. And even worse, different theories of ethics appear to contradict each other. Yet there were other problems, including that universal principles might be too general to provide specific guidance, as well as difficulties with the concept of object and intrinsic value, truth, justice, rights, and obligation. Such problems might be mitigated by avoiding necessary relations between ethical principles and particular actions, or by not emphasizing behavior, as in virtue theory, which focuses on character and living a good life. But virtue theory is notorious for not being able to provide guidance for one's actions. Yet there are also standard problems here of justification and motivation, or theory of action. Yet Anscombe, others and myself suggest retaining a virtue theory framework. That is, by replacing virtue theory with value theory ethics, and by replacing the moral good with a mode of value. On this view, value itself is the guiding principle, as well as having volitional and justifying value content. The question of whether ethics is still overwhelmed by problems or can still find a place in philosophy rests on solutions such as this one. Yet in my view, ethics and morality seem to be an inadequate category with which to understand the human condition. That is, the hidden functions of ethics is to accentuate the value status of the agent for good and bad. But I suggested that there were better ways of doing that than adopting a limited ethical perspective. That is, by understanding ethics and certain other human activities in terms of value. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like meetup.com or YouTube. The kind of response that I'm looking for is either approbation or criticism explaining where I have gone wrong.